There's only one movie that I have ever cried for. Actual tears streaming down my face like a teenage girl at a Taylor Swift concert. That movie is called Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. It's a Bollywood film that's based on heartbreak and unrequited love. I bop my head around to the vibrant Indian culture on the screen. After all, ta-da, I'm of Indian descent. But in 2009, my family and I took a trip to India, where I quickly noticed a profound disconnect. The warmth and the hospitality of the people were undeniable, but I soon realized that our similarities were just skin deep. Our habits, our interests, and our understanding of the scope of Indian culture were worlds apart. And this dissonance became more evident when I visited again in 23, and a store clerk in India asked me if I speak Hindi. I don't. Her curious, why not, always stuck with me. It made me reflect on, why does this cultural gap exist? Is it my fault? Is it my family's fault? Or is it rather the product of being in a globalized world that doesn't seem to prioritize cultural retention? Over generations, with the introduction of new languages and environments, I've lost the Indian heritage that I come from. No matter how many Indian beats I add to my Spotify playlist, I cannot reconnect with that which my ancestors failed to preserve when they were shipped off by British ships to South Africa in the 1860s. And that brings me to tonight's topic, cultural retention. The age of AI is here. We all know this. It's developing quickly. We know the impact of ChatGPT and the robotic ambitions of tech pioneers like Elon Musk. And therefore, the question needs to shift from what amazing things can AI do for us to rather, how do we, as dots on humanity's timeline, respond to AI's transformative powers? How important is it for us to hold on with our human hands to our roots? And therefore tonight I'm going to briefly share 3 key areas with you. Number 1, ethics in AI. Number 2, AI in education. And number 3, AI for cultural preservation. Tonight I hope to remind you that while the robots are getting ready to independently take action, we are in this weird sci-fi movie sort of situation where we need to actively engage to resist the erasure of the cultures that define us as human beings. When I worked as a junior lawyer in a law firm in South Africa, I saw how financial disparity influences access to legal justice. Wealthier clients, they had the money to solve luxury cases, such as property transfers, whilst the lower income people struggle to solve their most basic of legal needs, like custody disputes or domestic violence cases. The way the legal system is structured with billing and department targets, financial prosperity directly correlates with legal empowerment. Therefore, many times I saw wealthier people have their work prioritized, whilst poorer people had their work pushed to the side. This disparity parallels the challenges faced by AI in upholding ethical fairness. Consider 2 brands, Predpol and HunchLab. These are 2 AI-based tools used in criminal justice by US law enforcement agencies and parts of Europe too, as discussed by author Ishmael Mugari, a Walter Sisulu University student in South Africa. Now, Predpol, the first brand, it predicts crime hotspots using, get this, historical arrest data, whilst HunchLab factors in socioeconomic conditions too. Now, what we need to realize here is that both of these systems, they perpetuate systemic bias. And considering the nature and history of racial discrimination around the world, this is alarming that we allow this to happen in the 21st century. Predpol and HunchLab's algorithms, they often disproportionately target marginalized communities. Now this reinforces stereotypes rather than solving the root cause of the crime itself. Essentially, police presence is increased in typically black communities where historical arrests were mostly made, whether these arrests were lawful or not. To make matters worse, the transparency of these algorithms by these companies are heavily restricted. Therefore, we have no idea how they make their decisions. This is a complete lack of accountability. Similarly, a Chinese surveillance camera brand faces international scrutiny for apparently using their data to target the Uyghur people of Xinjiang. Now, this cannot happen. This is an example of how, in order to build an ethical AI culture framework, we need to actively engage by demanding transparency of algorithms and data used by AI-based platforms. This means pushing for bias-free data and also advocating for AI-free solutions where possible. Now, in the case of crime, as I was discussing, there's lots of evidence that shows that human intervention has better results than technology when solving crime. The University of New Jersey ran a study that showed that in several US states, over a period of 9 years, when government expenditure was increased in social wellness programs like mental health facilities, when the expenditure was increased by 10%, a 4% decrease was observed in violent criminal behavior. This shows us that whilst, yes, AI is on the innovation side of history, there can be no substitute for human intervention in this regard. As with law, ethical AI is about fairness. Without vigilance, we risk embedding existing inequalities in the systems that shape our future. Futurist and philosopher Grace Scott writes that an AI Bill of Rights needs to be constituted. But get this, he poses the following question: who is going to draft this Bill of Rights? Under the apartheid regime in South Africa, the Nationalist Party of 1948 focused on empowering the white minority whilst disregarding the rest. My mom and dad often speak about how they were not allowed to go to public toilets or go to parks, and they even couldn't go to rugby games. The majority of South Africa was disenfranchised, with little political power and little legal recourse for any civil or delictual damages that were incurred. Similarly, in France in 1830, King Louis Philippe, he focused on empowering the affluent bourgeoisie whilst ignoring the needs of the poor. The 1936 most democratic constitution in the world by Stalin in the Soviet Union also focused on the apex of the oligarchy, whilst ordinary citizens who tried to access these rights on paper were repressed as challenges. Now, why do we care? What we need to recognize here and be cognizant of is that these were real-life scenarios that came up when people were uninformed and unempowered. Therefore, without our vigilance, I foresee a future based on inequality and political immobilization. How do we engage? Number one, stay informed. Number two, join discussions. And number three, advocate. Or are we going to let Elon Musk decide the standards of AI? Leon Trotsky, the well-known commentator and critic of Stalin, wrote that the bureaucrat is the master of society. The worker, which is basically us, is crushed under the weight of the bureaucratic apparatus. If top technology like AI is controlled by the elite and powerful, though it may seem like society is progressing, societal inequality is increasing too. So how do we stay informed? Very simple. Start with the recalibration of your news sources. If you subscribe to traditional means like newspapers and online magazines, subscribe to those that focus on research and development in the AI field. If you use social media like many of us here, start by liking, following, and sharing AI commentators. In that way, your algorithms will be reset and you will be suggested similar content in the future. Now, AI is not just, in terms of ethics is not just technical, it's cultural. Can I see by a show of hands, how many of you here are actually concerned or give up about the impact of ChatGPT on the education system? A few people. I'm not seeing any young people's hands going up. Thank you very much. A few people. Now, I believe that as a teacher, we need to prepare our next generation for a tech-driven world whilst maintaining their decency. I was reminded of this recently when two 12th graders came to my office. Let's call them Larry and Kiki. They are two top-performing students with excellent character. But they came to show me some new AI software that can adapt AI-generated homework answers to make them less detectable by plagiarism checks. I was perplexed. Why would they do this? But this raises a more crucial question. How do we combat over-reliance on AI within education? Whether you're a parent, a community member, a teacher, a mentor, or a student, policy and legislation needs to focus on not just teaching kids how to use AI, but also when and why to use it too. In this way, we need to protect them to keep their decency and accountability. If we don't do this, we risk raising a next generation that is disconnected from discipline. But how do we do this? We do this by integrating lessons on culture, ethics, critical thinking, and cultural appreciation. Now, how do we engage? Number one, stay informed. Number two, join discussions. And number three, advocate. In 2022, the Pew Research Center found that 48% of Americans engaged in civic activity online by sharing posts or signing online petitions, probably related to politics. There is power in joining online forums. Forums such as Reddit or even Weibo or nowadays Xiaohongshu with the TikTok refugees. These are excellent places to build those connections and build a narrative. So for step two, get involved in these groups. In 2015, the Indian government faced a situation where they were tasked with amending legislation that would allow telecom companies to adjust their rates to charge customers different prices to access different websites. Of course, the community was outraged, but platforms such as Reddit and Twitter, now known as X, mobilized the Indian community to send complaints to the TRAI regulatory board. Ultimately, this board received more than 1 million emails, and the result? The Indian government decided not to amend the legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, there is power in your voice, and your voice can be heard just by showing up to online discussion groups. Thus far, I've shared my thoughts on what AI can do for our marginalized communities and for education. But what about the most important part of society, which is obviously me? On paper, I'm South African, but I identify as Indian, but I don't wear Indian clothes. I don't think that I have an Indian accent. I don't dance like an Indian, and even worse, I can't eat spicy food. And when I'm in a group of people, especially at school, my students always sing Waka Waka when they see me. A complete mess of culture. But this leads to a more profound question. Whose job is it to preserve cultural identity? Renowned scholar Stuart Hall writes that cultural identity isn't given to us. It's something that we create, and it's shaped by our history, our society, and the world around us. So as AI continues to redefine the perimeters of our lives, we need to hold on to that which makes us who we are, so that when the robots rise, and believe me, they're going to rise, we can ultimately stay in control. Consider the case study of the Welsh language. I was introduced to this fascinating language by the character Seamus Finnegan in Harry Potter. He says, "Me dad's a muggle, me mum's a witch, but if an nasty shot for him, would he find out?" This fascinating language dates back thousands of years, and it's embedded in regional poetry, literature, oral traditions, and of course history. But in the 21st century, or the 20th century rather, the language started to lose steam as it was seen as a lower means of communication. Though the UK government in the 90s tried to revive this dying horse from the ground, the Welsh language was dying. And by 2011, the UK census showed that 19% of Welsh people aged 3 and upwards can still speak Welsh. Only 19. And most of this number was concentrated amongst the elderly population. Now, imagine 20 years from now if Chinese becomes the enemy language. Imagine if English in 20 years from now is seen as a low-class mode of communication. What happens to all the values, the principles, the history that is embedded in our language and by extension our culture? What happens? It all disappears. Now, of course, AI technologies are trying to preserve language for future generations to access. But the challenge is not whether AI can do it. We know it can. The challenge is rather, will we let AI save our culture? Or will we let AI commodify and profit off of our culture? Hindi author Dr. Reena Arya of the London School of Economics wrote an article about a certain Canadian e-commerce brand, a very famous one, that in 2019 they sold doormats. And on this doormat, they printed the Indian flag. Now, in India, this would be considered desecration of a national symbol, something that is not allowed at all. Now, this shows that companies were profiting off the culture with no appreciation for the deeper significance or the meaning that's embedded in that culture. In this way, having diverse voices heard in the structure of AI tools is so fundamentally important. But how do we engage? Number 1, stay informed. Number 2, join discussions. And number 3, great, fantastic, thank you. Journalist Malcolm Gladwell writes that small actions in mass, meaning in a whole group of people, can tip the points of public policy. These can be small actions like sending in a complaint to your human resource manager, or sending a complaint email to a social media platform, or writing to your local legislator. These actions can actually cause change. In the South African legal system based on Roman Dutch law, we have this concept called boni mores, which comes from Latin, and this translates to the legal convictions of the community. Now, what this basically entails is that the nature of law anywhere, in any country, is always changing, is ever evolving. But ultimately, the will of the people, meaning what the people want, what all of you think is correct, ultimately can become the law of the land. Public policy becomes legislation. So if you have an idea of what you think is right, you need to make it heard. Ladies and gentlemen, We are entering into this new age where everything is a bit uncertain. Tonight I try to remind you that we need to set the culture going forward so that in the future when the robots are governing us, hopefully they won't, we can still have the power to resist and fight back. Yes, AI makes our lives easier. We can find new TikTok videos to learn dances to. We can book our holidays more effectively. And we can even have our essays written for us. But how can we ensure that our culture and our history and our heritage does not get taken away? Remember who you are and remember that it's so important. You are a product of everything that you come from. So please actively engage by number 1, staying informed, number 2, and number 3, as my favorite Imagine Dragons song says to conclude, welcome to the new age, to the new age, to the new age. Thank you.